Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I have another knitting tutorial for you. So in today's video, I'm going to be taking you step by step through how to make a pair of cable knit socks. So what these socks are is they start out up at the top, so they're cuff down socks. We begin with just a little bit of ribbing, then we're going to do a simple crossover cable all the way around the cuff. Once we finish the crossover cable, we're going to work a little bit of ribbing, and the amount of ribbing you want to work here is completely up to you. So if you want to work just a little bit of cable or a little bit of ribbing, you get a smaller cuff. If you want to work more, you get the longer cuff here. Then I'm going to show you how to do the heel flap and heel turn. Then to add a little bit of excitement to knitting the top portion of the sock right above the arch of your foot, I added in another cable design. So this way it kind of makes that ribbing taper off into just the plain stockinette, and I think it creates a really beautiful effect. Then lastly, we're just going to continue knitting through the foot, work our toe decreases, and then lastly, we're going to Kitchener stitch bind off. So the way I knit all my socks is using magic loop on a long circular knitting needle, so that'll be the method I'm showing you today. And you're going to find a few things in the description box down below. So first, you're going to find all the different video breakpoints. So that way, if you're just looking for one specific part of this video, let's say maybe you just want to look at the cable pattern above the arch of your foot, you can find that exact video breakpoint down below. You're also going to find the full written version of the pattern. So this written version includes 3 different sizes. So here you can see I have 3 sizes here. So we have the smallest size, medium size, this is the size I wear, and then we have the largest size here. So those are available in 3 sizes, and if you want to increase or decrease this pattern size to be a specific size for you, you just have to do it in multiples of 12 stitches, because that's what this top cable is in multiples of. So if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button, that way you stay up to date on all my future videos. Let's get started. The supplies you need for this project include, first, a circular knitting needle, and you do need a fairly large cord because we are doing magic loop. So you want between a 32-inch and a 40-inch cord on your circular knitting needle. To get the gauge, I used a size US 0. You'll want 1 tapestry needle, 1 stitch marker, 1 double pointed needle, and you want the double pointed needle to be the same size or about the same size as your circular knitting needle. So mine's a US 0 here. And then 1 pair of scissors. Today I'm going to be knitting using this Knit Picks Stroll Tonal. And thank you Knit Picks for providing the yarn for this tutorial. So I selected this yarn because I loved the color variation and how subtle it was. So let me tell you the colorway names that I have in front of me here. So first up, I have a purple color, because of course purple is my favorite. So this one's called the Blue Violet Tonal. Then I have a green. Thought this one was perfect for like early spring sock. So this one's called the Eucalyptus Tonal. They're each fingering weight with 462 yards per 100 grams. For the knitting needle, this one recommends a size US 1 to 3. It's 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And because it is superwash, we can machine wash and tumble dry these socks. Now in terms of how much yarn you're gonna use, the amount of yarn you need depends on 2 different factors, or really 3 different factors. So first is what size sock you choose, so do the small, medium, or large. The next factor is gonna be how long do you knit your cuff? And then lastly, what foot length are you knitting to? So as an example, I can tell you how much yarn I used for each one of these 3 socks if I had knit them as a pair. So I took the 1 sock, the amount of yarn I used, and multiplied it by 2. So starting off with a size small, this one I knit to about a US 5 or a 36 European size. And this one I used 174 meters or 190 yards. Next up, this one I knit the longer cuff on, and for the actual foot length, this one is knit to about a 10.5 or an 11 for US women's sizes, which is a 42 European. And this one, for a set of socks, I would use 283 meters or 310 yards. Lastly, for the size large, so this one I have a smaller cuff on. This one I knit to around a US 12 in men's or a 45 European. This one I used 350 yards or 320 meters. The nice thing about sock yarn is that it comes with a lot of yards per skein. So with one of the Knit Pick Stroll skeins, you're able to knit a set of socks. So you can make 2 of these or 2 of these or 2 of these, all within that 462 yards that you get per skein. So first up, I'm going to be working the cast on. So the cast on number of stitches is going to depend on the size that you're working. I'm going to be working the middle size that's written in the pattern, so I'm going to cast on a total of 72 stitches. And when I cast it on, I'm going to cast them all onto one knitting needle because I knit using magic loop, so I have my sock knitting needles here with a long cord. These ones are the Knit Picks Fixed Circulars, 40 inches, US 0, Caspian wood. And it's nice because they even match my yarn here. And so for magic loop, we just cast on all the stitches onto one knitting needle, and then later on we're gonna divide them in half. So again, I'm gonna cast on those 72 stitches because I'm knitting the medium size. And I would recommend using a stretchier cast on method. So something like the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. For my socks, I'm gonna be casting on using the German twisted cast on because that is my preferred method. And if you're curious about any of those cast ons that I just mentioned, I do have a video that I'll link down below for those. Now I finished casting on those stitches, so next up I'm just going to take my tail and tie it up out of the way, that way I don't accidentally start knitting with it. So next up what we want to do is we want to begin working knit 2, purl 2 ribbing in the round. So again, the way I knit in the round is I use magic loop. So the way I set up for magic loop is I'm going to grab onto all my stitches and I'm going to slide them all onto the cord. Then I'm going to count into the midway point. Okay, now that I'm at that midway point, I'm going to stretch out my work so I can see the cord there. And now I want to grab onto that cord, fold my work in half, and then pull my work up towards the knitting needles so that each half of the stitches ends up on one knitting needle. Okay, so next up, there's a couple things I want to check when I set up for magic loop. So the first thing is I want to make sure I have my knitting needle points going over towards the right. I want to make sure I have my working yarn or the yarn attached to the ball of yarn coming out my back knitting needle or the one furthest away from me. So to do that, I'm just going to turn this the other way, right? So I rearrange my knitting needles. Now my working yarn is coming out the one that's furthest away from me. And next up, I'm going to turn it so turn my work so all my cast on bumps are going down towards the table. You just want to make sure too that you aren't twisted in that inner corner in there. Okay, so now I've done everything to set up. So again, you want your knitting needle points towards the right, your working yarn coming out the back knitting needle or the one furthest away from you, and your work coming out down below the knitting needles towards the table. So now to actually work around in magic loop, you need to knit across the front knitting needle, turn your work, and knit across the back knitting needle. And that is one full round. So you need to do 2 knitting needles or 2 halves before that's 1 round. So now the last thing we want to note before we actually begin working the round is the first stitch that we're about to work, or is the next stitch we're about to work, a knit stitch or a purl stitch. So if it is a knit stitch, like ours is now, we want the working yarn coming up in between the 2 knitting needles and then just draped over the back knitting needle. That's how we set up when the first stitch is a knit stitch. If the first stitch is a purl stitch, you just leave the yarn hanging down below. Okay, so our first stitch is a knit stitch, so I'm going to bring the working yarn up in between the 2 knitting needles and then just drape it right over that back knitting needle. Now to actually begin working around, I'm gonna hold on to both knitting needles with my left hand, and I'm gonna pull the back knitting needle, or the one with the working yarn attached to it, over towards the right. Now when I do that, those stitches are gonna end up on the cord, and I wanna make sure I still have plenty of cord over here on the left-hand side. Now I just take this free knitting needle point, and I'm gonna go right into that first stitch on the front knitting needle as if to knit. So now I'm working knit 2, purl 2 ribbing. So I knit 1, knit the second one, bring my yarn to the front, purl 2. And I'm gonna continue working knit 2, purl 2 ribbing all the way across this front knitting needle. Okay, now that I've finished going across that first side, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna re-thread in my second knitting needle. So I'm just gonna push on the cord until the second half of the stitches there ends up back on a knitting needle. Now I wanna turn it so my knitting needle points are going over towards the right again. Let me just straighten out all my stitches here. And now again, when I sit up, I wanna check those 3 things again. So first, are my knitting needle points over towards the right? Is my working yarn coming out my back knitting needle, or the one furthest away from me? And is my work coming down towards the table? So all those things are correct for me. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna begin working the rest of that round. So I just finished on my other side with 2 purl stitches. So my next stitch is gonna be a knit stitch. So in that case, I'm gonna take my working yarn up in between the 2 knitting needles and then drape it over that back knitting needle. If your first stitch is a purl stitch, you just leave it right down below. And now, again, I'm gonna take that back knitting needle and I'm gonna pull it towards the right. And now I'm gonna continue working that ribbing. So whatever the next stitch in your ribbing pattern is. Okay, so now that I've finished that half of the stitches, again, I'm gonna re-thread in my back or my second knitting needle there. And you can do this on either before you turn it or after you turn it. I'm gonna turn my knitting needles again over towards the right, straighten out all my work here. And then check those 3 things again. So my knitting needle points over towards the right, my work coming out down below my knitting needles, and my working yarn is coming out my back knitting needle. So now that I've done both halves of the stitches, so I worked all the way across one knitting needle, turned my work, and worked all the way across the second knitting needle, that makes up 1 full round. If you only do 1 half of the stitches or 1 knitting needle, that's only half a round. You need to work around both. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna work another 2 full rounds of that knit 2, purl 2 ribbing, and then we're gonna begin that small cable design. So again, 2 full rounds means we need to do 1, 2, 3, 4 knitting needle turns. So I'll come back and catch back up with you when I'm ready to begin those cables. So now next up, we're gonna be adding in those cable stitches. So all I have in front of me is my work, and then I'm adding on 1 double pointed knitting needle that is the same size as my sock knitting needle. And the reason I use a small double pointed needle is that the cable needles they typically sell are much larger sizes, so they're meant for like a DK or worsted weight yarn, whereas I found just a little double pointed needle works really well as a small cable needle. So what we're actually going to be doing here is we're going to be working these cable stitches to create these little designs at the top of the sock. So each one of these designs takes up exactly 12 stitches. So it's a 12 stitch repeat all the way around. That's why all the stitch counts for the different sizes are divisible by 12. So I'm going to walk you through this first row here and talk about some of the different cables. All the cables in the pattern are available as either written out, so they're written out line by line, or there's also a chart available. So whichever way you prefer to read your cables is how you can do that here. And if you want to learn how to read a cable knitting chart, I do have another video for that one, which I'll link up above right here. But let's just do this first repeat over the 12 stitches. Okay, so again, I'm going to pull my back knitting needle towards the right so those stitches end up on the cord. Now I'm going to take my cable needle, also known as my double pointed needle, and I'm going to slide those first 2 stitches onto the cable needle, hold them in the front of my work. Now I'm going to take my right knitting needle, the one that's attached to the circular knitting needle here. I'm going to go right into that next stitch, and I'm going to purl that stitch. That one can be a little tricky to get to. Just going to pull it a little tighter. Now I'm going to bring my yarn in between my 2 green knitting needles here to the back of my work, so I'm ready to knit. Now I'm going to slide my cable needle so that the stitches end up at the right point. And I'm going to take my right green knitting needle here, and I'm going to go right into each one of those 2 stitches on my cable needle as if to knit, or knitting. Okay, so again, that was our first cable stitch. Now, next up, we're just gonna purl 1, then knit 2. Purl 1, and now we have our next cable stitch. So here, I'm gonna slide the next stitch on my left knitting needle onto the cable needle, and I'm gonna hold it behind my work here. I'm gonna bring my working yarn in between my 2 green knitting needles to the back of my work. I'm gonna knit the next 2 stitches from my left knitting needle. Now I'm gonna slide my cable needle so that that stitch being held on the cable needle ends up at the rightmost point. Bring my yarn to the front so I can purl. Then purl into that stitch being held on the cable needle. Now the final part of this repeat is just purl 2. Great, so that was our 12 stitch repeat. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to begin that 12 stitch repeat again. So I need to slide the next 2 stitches onto my cable needle, hold them in the front of my work. Purl 1 stitch from my left hand knitting needle. Bring my yarn to the back, slide the cable needle over, knit the 2 stitches being held on the cable needle. And that's all there is to it. So I'm going to continue working this full round, and then I'll come back and show you the next round. So now that we finished that first full cable round where we worked the cable pattern across the first knitting needle, turned our work, and worked the cable stitches across the back knitting needle, we're ready to work our next round, which just incorporates knit and purl stitches. So again, in this round, there's a 12 stitch repeat. So the repeat is purl 1, knit 2, purl 1, knit 2, purl 1, knit 2, purl 3. Then I'll put that up on the screen just so it's less confusing. Then I'm gonna repeat that 12 stitch repeat over and over again all the way across this round. Then after we've completed this just plain knit and purl round, we're gonna go back again and we're gonna work another cable round. And that's the way we're gonna continue alternating between those 2 rounds all the way up through this cable pattern. So we're gonna do 1 cable round, 1 regular knit and purl stitch round, 1 cable round, 1 knit and purl stitch round, all the way through this portion, and then eventually we'll just end up back at a nice little 2x2 rib. So there's a couple things you want to keep in mind as you're working these cable rows as we continue through. So first is that you want to make sure you're working each pattern on each half of the stitches to make up 1 full round. And then the second thing is you want to make sure you're paying attention during each cable stitch, whether or not that stitch that's being held in the back, or the purl stitch as we just worked before, whether or not that stitch is purled or knit. So in these first few rows up here, we'll see that the stitch being held in the back or moving behind these knit stitches is always purled, but then in this center portion, it becomes a knit stitch. So just something to keep in mind, and then it goes back to a purl stitch again. So I've made sure to bold that in the pattern so that you pay attention to what those stitches are that we're working in each one of the cable stitches. So now I'm going to continue working all the way through this cable portion, and then we're just going right back to 2x2 rib. I just want to give a quick tip here on what to do when you end up with a cable that needs to go in between the two sides of magic loop. So this won't happen in the 72 stitch size because the cables are evenly spaced out between the two sides. So over here, we just end up with a bunch of purl stitches. But in the other two sizes that are available, you will end up with a situation where you have to move a cable in between the front and the back knitting needle. So let's say, for instance, I need to work a 3-stitch cable right here at the end. So I'd want to take this last purl stitch, hold it in the back of my work, and then knit the next 2 stitches. But I can't get to those next 2 stitches, so what do I do? So what I think is the easiest way to do this is all I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna take this left knitting needle and I'm just gonna pull on the left knitting needle so that that single stitch slides over to the other side of my work. Now I can thread back in that knitting needle, and now I can work that cable just as I normally would, right? So I can slide it on my stitch holder, knit those 2 stitches, and then keep on going with my cable. So that is one example there. Then once you finish doing all the cables, what I would recommend doing is just going back through and redividing your work. So making sure you have half the stitches on one side and half the stitches on the other side. That's not quite as important until we get all the way down to the heel. So that is how I deal with having a little cable stitch that needs to cross over between the 2 knitting needles. So now that you've completed that top cable pattern, the next thing we need to do is we want to figure out how long you want to make the cuff of your sock. So here I have 3 different examples. So in the smallest size here, this is what 1/2 inch of ribbing looks like. Then on this next size, so these are my own socks right here, so this is kind of my preferred length. So here I went for 3 inches. And then lastly, we have somewhere in between, so this makes a nice really short sock right here. So this is 1.5 inches of that ribbing past the cable. So those are just 3 little options to show you what the different lengths look like. So now I've knit all the way through the cuff, and what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna add in the heel flap. So the way a heel flap is worked is it's worked just back and forth over half of our stitches. So when I begin working the heel flap, I always make sure I'm at the beginning of a new round. So I can tell that because we have my tail of yarn down here at the bottom right-hand corner of my work. So that means I'm about to start a new round. So these new repeat rows that we're working for the heel flap are going to be worked back and forth over just these first half of the stitches. And there's 2 repeat rows we're going to work over and over again. So first, to begin the repeat rows, I'm going to take my working yarn up in between my 2 knitting needles and lay it over the back knitting needle, just so I make sure I don't end up with a yarn over. I'm going to slide my back knitting needle to the right, and then I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise with the yarn behind, which the way we just set it up, it is automatically behind. Then I'm going to knit 1 stitch. I'm going to slip 1 purlwise, knit 1 stitch. And I'm going to continue this all the way across. Slip 1 purlwise, knit 1 stitch. Now I finish with that slip 1 purlwise, knit 1 stitch. Now I'm going to turn my work, but I don't actually want to thread back in this other knitting needle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work across the back side of those same exact stitches. So we're not working across the rest of the round, we're working across the back half of the stitches we just worked. So to work across these, we're going to slip the first stitch purlwise. Now I'm going to purl across these stitches. Now I'm going to turn my work. So now that I've turned my work again, I'm not going to thread back in this knitting needle again this time, right? I'm just going to begin working with it. So on this side again, I'm going to be working that first repeat row. So that one was slip the first stitch purlwise, knit 1, slip a stitch purlwise, knit 1. and continue going all the way across this row. Then turn your work, slip the first stitch purlwise, purl all the way across. And I'm gonna continue repeating these 2 rows over and over again for the number of repeats noted in the pattern. And each sock size does have a different number of repeats to work, so be sure to pay attention to that one. So I'll come back and show you what my heel flap looks like once I've worked through all the repeats. So now I've finished my heel flap here, and the first thing I do when I finish my heel flap is I just double check that I do have the right number of rows in my heel flap. So to do that, I just turn my work to the side, and along the edge, you can see I have this column of slipped stitches. So what I do is I just count all the way up these. So again, it always tries to fold over a little bit, so just make sure you're looking all the way at that lastmost row. Start at the bottom, so the slip stitches are gonna be the large ones along the edge, so you can kind of look for the last bar that connected the front and back of your work. Go to the stitch right above that, so that's my first slip stitch. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and then the last one on my knitting needle makes 18. So for my size, that's exactly right, because the number of slip stitches you should have along the side is equivalent to the number of repeats you did of those 2 rows. So now I'm all ready to begin the heel turn. And again, the heel turn is just going to be worked flat on these stitches. So we're going to knit across to a certain number of stitches, turn our work, work back and forth while we slowly begin increasing over and over again. So first, I'll show you the first few rows, and then we can all just continue working on through the heel. So to start off, I'm going to slip the first stitch purlwise. Then I'm going to knit 19. So the number of stitches you knit depends on the size you're working. For my size, it's the 19 stitches. Next up, I need to work a slip, slip, knit. So to work a slip, slip, knit, I slip the next stitch from my left hand knitting needle onto my right hand knitting needle as if to knit. I slip another stitch from my left to right knitting needle as if to knit. Now I pass them both back over to my right knitting needle. So I take my left knitting needle, go right into the front of each one of those stitches at the same time. Slide them back over. And then you can either just leave your left knitting needle, or sorry, your right knitting needle in the back there, or you can insert it again. So just go into the back of both of those stitches, knit them together. So to work that stitch, we slip the 2 stitches to twist them. Then we pass them back over to the left knitting needle. Then we knit them together through the back loop. Now I need a knit 1, and I'm gonna turn my work now. So we aren't gonna work the rest of these stitches here, we're just gonna turn our work. Now on this side, I'm gonna slip my first stitch purlwise. Now I'm gonna purl 5. And now I'm gonna work a purl 2 together. So I'm just gonna take my right knitting needle into the base of the next 2 stitches, wrap my yarn around, push through. So that's a purl 2 together. Now I'm gonna purl 1. And again, I'm not gonna work the rest of these stitches, I'm just gonna turn my work. Now on this side, again, I'm gonna slip the first stitch purlwise, so I don't wanna twist it. Now I'm gonna knit 6. And now I wanna work another slip, slip, knit. So an easy way to tell you're in the right place is that you should see kind of like this gap forming in between the 2 stitches that you're gonna work the slip, slip, knit on. Or on the opposite side, you're gonna see a gap forming in between the 2 stitches where you work the purl 2 together. So again, for my slip, slip, knit, I'm gonna slip 1 stitch as if to knit, so to twist it. Slip the second stitch as if to knit, to twist it. Now I'm gonna pass them both back over to my left knitting needle. Now I'm gonna knit them together through the back loop. Knit 1, ignore the rest of these stitches, turn my work, and now again I'm gonna slip the first stitch purlwise, Now I'm going to purl 7. And I can tell I'm in the right place because there's that gap forming in between the 2 stitches I'm about to purl 2 together. So I'm going to put my right knitting needle into each one of those stitches as if to purl, wrap my yarn around and push it through, purl 1. Now again, I'm going to turn my work. And as you can see through these repeats, we're just keep on going out further and further. And eventually, once we finish the number of rows for our size, we'll reach the end point. And you can also already see the little tiny heel forming. So it's a nice way to visually see that you're doing everything correctly. So now I'm going to continue working all the way up through these heel flap rows. And then next up, I'll show you how to pick up the heel flap stitches. Okay, so I've just finished my heel flap. And now, rather than turning my work to work across the purl side, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna rotate my work 90 degrees. So I have the heel facing me, and I have the side of my heel flap that's closest to where the working yarn is coming out of, kind of like ready to work. So what we're gonna be doing here is we're gonna go along this edge, and we're gonna pick up each one of those slip stitches, and we're gonna knit into them. So the first thing we wanna do is we wanna find the first slip stitch that we wanna pick up. So you can see that the working yarn is currently going through these topmost stitches right here where we worked that last slip slip knit. So I'm gonna go to the one right below that, and I'm gonna pick up both halves of that slip stitch. So we can see we have that slip stitch edge, and I'm picking up both sides of that V. With my left hand knitting needle, now I'm just gonna knit right into those 2 bars. Now I'm going to go down to the next slip stitch. I'm going to pick up both sides of those bars, and I'm going to knit right into both of them. And I'm just going to continue doing this all the way down this edge. Okay, so now I've finished picking up all those slip stitches down that side of the heel flap. So now I'm gonna turn my work. So now the top side of my sock with the ribbing on it that we haven't worked in a while is gonna be facing up. I'm gonna re-thread in my second knitting needle. And this is the point where we begin working in the round again. So I'm gonna pull my back knitting needle towards the right, and I'm gonna begin working across the front half of the stitches. So here I'm gonna knit 2, purl 2 all the way across these front stitches. Now I'm gonna place a stitch marker. And again, before I turn my work, I'm just gonna have the other side of the heel flap facing up. So what I wanna do now is I'm gonna go along this edge, starting at the inner corner here, and go all the way up along here and pick up each one of the slip stitches along this edge. Now that I've gone all the way along that side and picked up each one of those heel flap stitches, I'm gonna turn my work. And now we've picked up all the stitches we need to. So when I look at my 2 knitting needles, the way I have all my stitches set up are first I have those heel turn stitches. Then I have the first side of my heel flap. On the other knitting needle, I have the full top side of my sock, so where all that ribbing still is. And then I have the second half of my heel flap stitches. So this first round, what we're gonna start off with is we're gonna start off with a knit 2 together. And the reason there is this knit 2 together right here is because when we were working the heel turn, we worked 1 extra decrease over here on the slip slip knit side, and we didn't finish with a purl 2 together over here. So we need to kind of make up for that. So we work that knit 2 together at the beginning of this next round. Then we're gonna work all the way across the bottom stitches, all the way up the first side of the heel flap until 2 stitches remain. And then right up here, we're gonna work a knit 2 together on those final 2 stitches. Then when we turn our work, we're gonna begin working the little cables that taper these in and create the point. So we can see this on the purple sock. So we wanna basically begin tapering in 2 knit stitches on either side using small cables so that the whole top of the sock turns into plain stockinette all the way around. So to do that, I'll show you the cable that we need to do at the beginning and the end of the top of the sock. Then over here on the opposite side, we're gonna do a slip slip knit right after the stitch marker, then knit down this side. So it's a bit tricky on this first setup round because there are a lot of things going on, but I'm just gonna break it down for you here in this first round. So again, first, I'm gonna start off with a knit 2 together. And now I'm gonna knit all the way up the bottom stitches and then up the one side of the heel flap until 2 stitches remain. Now I'm gonna work a knit 2 together on these last 2 stitches, and I'm gonna turn my work. So now before I begin showing you the actual cabling on the top of the sock, what I wanted to do is just give you a quick overview of what we were going for. So in each one of these socks, what we wanna do is we wanna take the outer 2 most sets of knit stitches on the top portion of the sock, and we want to use those as cable stitches and just bring in those set of 2 knit stitches. So it is important to remember that the cabling pattern is going to be slightly different depending on which size you choose. So first off, it's going to be different because different sizes start the top of the sock with either 2 knit stitches or with 2 purl stitches. So the medium size starts with 2 knit stitches, and this is going to be the one I show you in the video. Now the other 2 sizes, they use very similar cabling patterns. These ones just start with 2 purl stitches in here, so we need to work those before we begin the cabling. So that's something that's important to remember, is make sure you're downloading the cable chart that's specific to your size. The other difference is, of course, we have different numbers of stitches, so this cabling pattern is going to last for different lengths and, be a different size. So again, the one I'm going to be showing you in the video is this center size, the middle size or size medium. And here we have the 2 knit stitches that we start with, so we're going to immediately begin cabling those in. Then we're going to work across in just our regular ribbing, and we want to make sure our ribbing matches up with the cuff. We're going to work all the way across until we reach those last 2 knit stitches over here, and then we want to cable those ones inwards. So we actually need to stop 1 stitch before because we do want to cable those towards the right. But that's all described in the pattern. Now for the other 2 sizes, the large one and the small one, these ones actually begin with 2 purl stitches before we get to where we begin cabling. So you want to be sure to pay attention to that. You don't want to just start off with the cable the same way we do in the video with this one. You want to be sure to take care of those purl stitches first and work them as knit stitches as described in the pattern, then begin the cabling. So I hope that helps to give you a quick little general overview. Now let's get back to the video where I'm going to be showing you this cable stitch right here. Now over here, I'm going to be using my little cable needle again. I'm going to slide the first 2 stitches. So it's just a knit 2 that I'm sliding on to my cable needle, and I'm holding it in the front of my work. Then I'm going to knit 1. So I need to make sure my working yarn is coming out up over that back knitting needle so I don't end up with an extra yarn over. Gonna knit the next stitch for my left hand knitting needle. And then I'm gonna knit the 2 stitches being held on my cable needle. Now I'm gonna continue working the ribbing pattern all through the center part until there are 5 stitches remaining before my stitch marker. So we can see the next stitch in this cable pattern, we're basically just following whatever the stitch right below it is. So the stitch right below this next one on my left knitting needle has a bump in front of it, so that one's a purl. Then we've got 2 knits, 2 purls, and I just follow the ribbing pattern all the way across. So now I'm all ready to work that next little cable. So I'm going to take the next stitch on my left knitting needle, slide it onto my cable needle, hold it in the back of my work. I'm gonna knit 2 stitches for my left-hand knitting needle. And now I'm gonna knit the 1 stitch being held on my cable needle. Now I'm gonna knit those final 2 stitches before the stitch marker. It looks like I accidentally have a yarn over there, so I'm just gonna drop that one. I'm gonna knit those final 2, and that's a mistake. Okay, so now I'm gonna pass my stitch marker, and now right after the stitch marker, I'm gonna work a slip, slip, knit. So I'm gonna slip 1 stitch as if to knit, slip the next stitch as if to knit, slide them both back over to the left knitting needle, now knit them together through the back loop, and I'm gonna knit all the way down the rest of the stitches on this side. Now I'm gonna turn my work. So that was our first kind of like setup row where we introduce the cables and all the decreases. So now on this next round, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna knit all the way across the back knitting needle, turn our work, then work in pattern across the front side of the sock. So what I mean by that is you're gonna knit anywhere where you knit on the previous round or purl anywhere you purled on the previous round. And then we're just gonna knit all the way across the other side of the heel flap. And that's the way that second round is always gonna go. Then once we finish that round, again, we're gonna work all the way up this knitting needle until 2 stitches remain, work a decrease, turn our work, and then again, we're gonna be working those cables again to keep on bringing it into that point, slip our stitch marker, work another decrease, and then knit all the way across. Then again, we work in pattern. So those are the 2 rounds we're gonna be alternating in between. And now we're gonna continue repeating those 2 rounds over and over again until first you finish off the decreases. So you'll know you've finished off the decreases where we decrease on either side of the heel flap here when the stitches on the one side of the heel flap plus the bottom side of the sock plus the second side of the heel flap is equal to the number of stitches you have on the top side of your sock. So whatever your stitch count is, divided by 2, so for me that's 36. Once the 2 sides of my heel flap and the bottom of the sock, that total stitch count equals 36 again, I'm gonna stop the decreases and just knit all the way around. But I'm gonna continue doing the cables on the top of the sock all the way up through that point. So I'll have each of the cable stitches written out in the pattern, and I'll also include a chart as well, so that way if you prefer reading a chart, you can read it that way. So now I'll come back and show you the next step. So now I've continued working all the way up through the foot of the sock. And you can see that once I finished that cable pattern, I just worked round after round of just plain stockinette all the way up through where the measurement I needed to get to was. So typically I leave about 2 inches between the end of the sock and where I want it to be and where I stop knitting before my decreases. And that leaves plenty of room for my toe decreases. So when I actually work the toe decreases, I like to make sure I have the heel flap side of my sock facing up, because that for me is where my beginning of the round marker is. So I want to make sure that I have my stitches evenly divided between my 2 knitting needles, and the beginning of the round should be right over here at this inner corner. So now the toe decreases really are pretty standard. So what we're gonna be doing is we're gonna work knit the first stitch, do a slip, slip, knit until 3 stitches remain on this first knitting needle, work a knit 2 together, knit 1, turn our work, and then work that exact same thing on the other side. Then once we work 1 decrease round where we decrease on each knitting needle, we're gonna just regular knit all the way across, knit all the way across again. So work 2 full knit rounds. Then we'll do another decrease round, and we'll keep on alternating between just plain knitting and working decrease rounds. So to just show you those decreases really quickly, so first I knit the first stitch, then I work a slip, slip, knit. So I slip the first stitch as if to knit, slip the next stitch as if to knit, pass them both back over to my left knitting needle, then knit them together through the back. I'm gonna knit until 3 stitches remain. Now I'm gonna work a knit 2 together, so I'm gonna take my right knitting needle point from the left to the right into the base of the next 2 stitches, work them together, knit the final stitch, turn my work and work that exact same thing on this side. So I'm gonna knit the first stitch, work a slip, slip, knit, knit until 3 stitches remain, work a knit 2 together, knit the final stitch, turn my work again. So that was one decrease round. So to work the decrease round, we did decrease on the front knitting needle and decrease on the back knitting needle. Now the pattern tells me to knit 2 full rounds, and then I'm gonna work another one of those decrease rounds. And I'm gonna keep on alternating between the two as described in the pattern. Now last, I'll be back to show you the Kitchener stitch up at the top of the toe. So now I've finished up those toe decreases, so the last thing I have to do is the Kitchener stitch. So I'm gonna unwind a little bit of yarn here. Probably have about 18 inches or so. I'm gonna cut it right there. And now I'm gonna take my tapestry needle and thread it with that tail. So for the Kitchener stitch, there's 2 setup stitches and then a 4-stitch repeat. So first I'm gonna start out with my yarn down below in between the 2 knitting needles. I'm gonna go through my first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to purl. I'm gonna leave it on that front knitting needle. And then I'm gonna go underneath the knitting needle into the first stitch on my back knitting needle as if to knit. Leave that stitch on the knitting needle as well. So now that I've done those 2 setup stitches, I'm ready to begin the repeat. So first for the repeat, I'm gonna go into the first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to knit. Now I'm gonna slide that stitch off the front knitting needle. Now I'm gonna go into the new first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to purl. Gonna leave that stitch on my knitting needle. Now I'm gonna go into the new first stitch on my back knitting needle. Slide that one off my back knitting needle. Now I'm gonna go into that new first stitch on the back knitting needle as if to knit. Leave that one on the knitting needle. So that's the 4-stitch repeat. So to show it one more time, I'm gonna go into the first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to knit, slide that one off the front knitting needle, go into the new first stitch on my front knitting needle as if to purl, leave that one on the knitting needle, go into the first stitch on my back knitting needle, purlwise, slide that one off the knitting needle, go into the new first stitch on the back knitting needle, knitwise, leave that one on the knitting needle. And as I go along, I'm just gently pulling on the stitches, right? Just to tighten it up a bit, but you don't want it too tight. So now I'm gonna continue repeating that all the way across, and I basically just continue repeating the pattern as much as I can. Eventually you'll run out of things you can do over here, and then I just thread my tapestry needle through that final stitch. So I'll put up the written instructions to Kitchener stitch on the screen now. I hope you've enjoyed knitting socks with me today. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. Also, don't forget that down in the description box below is the full written version of the pattern. That way you can pick one of the 3 sizes and create your own socks. I'll see you next time.